Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to begin the task of having a series of Q&As on Dr. Jung's book, Answer to Job. And I'm working with the 2010 edition of Answer to Job, which you can see here. In order to begin this, let me just say that I've read the entirety of Answer to Job into the YouTube channel. So if you want to just listen to the entirety of Answer to Job, you can find it. You can find the playlist for it on the home page of our YouTube channel. And so what I'm going to do is work my way through the various chapters. I'm going to do my best to do this on Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I'm going to begin today with the foreword of the 2010 edition of Answer to Job, and then I will come back for Q&A after each of these segments. There's three segments that I'm going to include in this Q&A session today. So the first segment is Sonu Shamdasani's foreword, and I'm going to play it for you now. It's just 6 minutes long. I'm going to read Answer to Job by C.G. Jung. On the back cover, it says the following. Considered one of Jung's most controversial works, Answer to Job also stands as Jung's most extensive commentary on a biblical text. Here he confronts the story of the man who challenged God, the man who experienced hell on earth and still did not reject his faith. Job's journey parallels Jung's own experience, as reported in the Red Book, Liber Novus, of descending into the depths of his own unconscious, confronting and reconciling the rejected aspects of his soul. This paperback edition of Jung's classic work includes a new foreword by Sonu Shamdasani, Philemon Professor of Jung History at University College London, described by Shamdasani as the theology behind the Red Book. Answer to Job examines the symbolic role that theological concepts play in an individual's psychic life. This video will cover excerpts of the foreword to the 2010 edition by Sonu Shamdasani. On 29 May 1951, Jung wrote to Agnella Jaffe from his tower at Bollingen, "I have landed the great whale, I mean Answer to Job." What did he mean by this? Answer to Job is the culmination of 4 decades of Jungian thought. As Marie-Louise von Franz recalled, Jung wrote in one burst of energy and with strong emotion during an illness and after a high fever, and when he finished it, he felt well again. He later remarked to von Franz that, quote, he would like to rewrite all of his books except Answer to Job. He would leave that one just as it stands. In his prefatory note, Jung wrote that he had been occupied with the central problem of the book for years. No wonder, for it was in Answer to Job that the theology first articulated in the Red Book, the themes of the progressive incarnation of God and the replacement of the one-sided Christian God image with one that encompassed evil within, found its definitive expression and elaboration. In the winter of 1913, Jung embarked on a process of self-experimentation. He deliberately gave free rein to his fantasy thinking and carefully noted what ensued. He later called this process active imagination. He wrote down these fantasies in the Black Books. These are not personal diaries, but rather the records of a self-experimentation. The dialogues that form these active imaginations can be regarded as a type of thinking in a dramatic form. When World War I broke out, Jung considered that a number of his fantasies were precognitions of this event. This led him to compose the first draft of the Red Book, which consisted of a transcription of the main fantasies from the Black Books, together with a layer of interpretive commentaries and lyrical elaboration. Here, Jung attempted to derive general psychological principles from the fantasies, as well as to understand to what extent the events portrayed in the fantasies presented, in symbolic form, developments that were to occur in the world. Jung recopied the manuscript in an ornate Gothic script into the large leather folio volume, which he illustrated with his own paintings. The overall theme of the book is how Jung regains his soul and overcomes the contemporary malaise of spiritual alienation. This is ultimately achieved by enabling the rebirth of a new image of God in his soul and developing a new worldview in the form of a psychological and theological cosmology. In Jung's fantasies during World War I, a new God had been born in his soul. Jung saw this figure as representing the uniting of the Christian God with Satan, and hence as depicting a transformation of the Western God image. Now, when we say God image, Dr. Jung later said that human beings can't differentiate God, the metaphysical God, from the God image which appears in the depth psychology of all human beings. Dr. Jung said, "I understood that the new God would be in the relative. If the God is absolute beauty and goodness, how should he encompass the fullness of life, which is beautiful and hateful, good and evil, laughable and serious, human and inhuman? How can man live in the womb of the God if the Godhead himself attends only to one half of him?" Okay, you're right. Sorry, Shea. Thank you very much for pointing it out to me. I'm turning off my microphone when I'm not on the screen so as not to have extraneous sound. Hello, Alexander. Welcome. Um, so now you've heard the introduction from Sonu Shamdasani. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions on this presentation before I begin Dr. Jung's writing itself? If I see none, I'm going to go ahead and play the next segment, which will be Dr. Jung's preface, his own preface to the book. Seeing no objection at the moment, I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll come back on and we can have a discussion after that. By C.G. Jung. This is the preparatory note. The suggestion that I should tell you how Answer to Job came to be written sets me a difficult task, because the history of this book can hardly be told in a few words. I have been occupied with its central problem for years. Many different sources nourished the stream of its thoughts, until one day, and after long reflection, the time was right to put them into words. The most immediate cause of my writing the book is perhaps to be found in certain problems discussed in my book Aeon, especially the problems of Christ as a symbolic figure and of the antagonism Christ-Antichrist. In connection with the discussion of these problems and of the doctrine of redemption, I criticize the idea of the privatio boni as not agreeing with the psychological findings. Psychological experience shows that whatever we call good is balanced by an equally substantial bad or evil. If evil is non-existent, then whatever there is must needs be good. Dogmatically, neither good nor evil can be derived from man, since the evil one existed before man as one of the sons of God. The idea of the privatio boni began to play a role in the Church only after Mani. Before this heresy, Clement of Rome taught that God rules the world with a right and a left hand, the right being Christ, the left Satan. Clement's view is clearly monotheistic, as it unites the opposites in one God. Later Christianity, however, is dualistic, inasmuch as it splits off one half of the opposites personified in Satan, and he is eternal in his state of damnation. This crucial question of from whence evil forms the point of departure for the Christian theology of redemption. It is therefore of prime importance. If Christianity claims to be a monotheism, it becomes unavoidable to assume the opposites as being contained in God. But then we are confronted with a major religious problem, the problem of Job. It is the aim of my book to point out its historical evolution since the time of Job, down through the centuries to the most recent symbolic phenomena, such as the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. Moreover, the study of medieval natural philosophy, of the greatest importance to psychology, made me try to find an answer to the question, what image of God did these old philosophers have? Or rather, how should the symbols which supplement their image of God be understood? All this pointed to a complexio oppositorum, and thus recalled again the story of Job to my mind. Job, who expected help from God against God. This most peculiar fact presupposes a similar conception of the opposites in God. On the other hand, numerous questions, not only from my patients, but from all over the world, brought up the problem of giving a more complete and explicit answer than I had given in Aeon. For many years I hesitated to do this because I was quite conscious of the probable consequences and knew what a storm would be raised. But I was gripped by the urgency and difficulty of the problem and was unable to throw it off. Therefore, I found myself obliged to deal with the whole problem, and I did so in the form of describing a personal experience carried by subjective emotions. I deliberately chose this form because I wanted to avoid the impression that I had any idea of announcing an eternal truth. The book does not pretend to be anything but the voice or question of a single individual who hopes or expects to meet the thoughtfulness of the public. When Answer to Job was published, it received huge criticism from theologians and psychologists. Theologians, of course, depended for the income of their organizations the traditional stories of Christianity passed down for 2,000 years. Most psychologists and governments had moved on in mental health to a superficial view of psychology, behaviorism and such, which said that you could solve mental health problems with a pill. You can't. Dr. Jung's entire work of depth psychology was showing how we really have to find our mental health. This is not popular with health insurance companies because it requires careful evaluation of the psyche of the individual. Okay, so that's a completion of Dr. Jung's preface to Answer to Job. Are there any thoughts and questions on this at this point? Anything at all? Notice that Dr. Jung is pointing out that his style of talking about the situation of God is that God is a complexio oppositorum, meaning that he has both good and bad sides. Welcome, Miles. Nice to see you. I've on this so far, I've played 2 segments of the beginning of Answer to Job, and I will be playing a third right now, and then we can come back and talk about this a little further. I have discussed it at length in my reading group over the last year, beginning over a year ago. But I thought that as the subscribership and membership has grown up around the world, that I ought to come back and revisit this, as this is a very important book in Dr. Jung's oeuvre. So are there any other questions, at the moment that might come up? If not, I will play the third segment that I intended to play today. Again, this is about a 5-minute segment, and it's the beginning of Answer to Job. And so let me just get that up for you. We do not know how clear or unclear these images, metaphors, and concepts are in respect to their transcendental object. If, for instance, we say God, I'm sorry, that was at the beginning of, or that was in the middle of the video, so I'm starting it over at the beginning. 50th anniversary edition with a new foreword by Sonu Shamdasani, editor of the Red Book. Answer to Job appears in volume 11 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, and in those volumes, each paragraph was numbered. Because Answer to Job falls in the middle of volume 11, it begins with paragraph 553 and ends with paragraph 758. In this video, I'm going to read from Dr. Jung's original preface, which he named Lectori Benevolo, and he referred to a specific biblical text. I am distressed for thee, my brother, from 2 Samuel 1:26. Paragraph 553. On account of its somewhat unusual content, my little book requires a short preface. I beg you, dear reader, not to overlook it, for in what follows I speak of the venerable objects of religious belief. Whoever talks of such matters inevitably runs the risk of being torn to pieces by the two parties who are in mortal conflict about those very things. This conflict is due to the strange supposition that a thing is true only if it presents itself as a physical fact. Thus, some people believe it to be physically true that Christ was born as the son of a virgin, while others deny this as a physical impossibility. Everyone can see that there is no logical solution to this conflict, and that one would do better not to get involved in such sterile disputes. Both are right and both are wrong. Yet they could easily reach agreement if only they dropped the word physical. Physical is not the only criterion of truth. There are also psychic truths which can neither be explained nor proved nor contested in any physical way. If, for instance, a general belief existed that the river Rhine had at one time flowed backwards from its mouth to its source, then this belief would in itself be a fact, even though such an assertion, physically understood, would be deemed utterly incredible. Beliefs of this kind are psychic facts which cannot be contested and need no proof. So in this paragraph 553, Dr. Jung has introduced one of the most fundamental ideas of Answer to Job, which is the idea that there are both physical and psychic facts. This becomes much more important later in the book, but he's pointing out that psychic facts don't need to be physical to be true. Paragraph 554. Religious statements are of this type. They refer without exception to things that cannot be established as physical facts. If they did not do this, they would inevitably fall into the category of the natural sciences. Taken as referring to anything physical, they make no sense whatever, and science would dismiss them as not experienceable. They would be mere miracles, which are sufficiently exposed to doubt as it is, and yet they could not demonstrate the reality of the spirit or meaning that underlies them, because meaning is something that always demonstrates itself and is experienced on its own merits. The spirit and meaning of Christ are present and perceptible to us even without the aid of miracles. Miracles appeal only to the understanding of those who cannot perceive the meaning. They are mere substitutes for the not understood reality of the Spirit. This is not to say that the living presence of the Spirit is not occasionally accompanied by marvelous physical happenings. I only wish to emphasize that these happenings can neither replace nor bring about an understanding of the Spirit, which is the one essential thing. In this paragraph, Dr. Jung has introduced the idea of meaning as critical for the human psyche. Paragraph 555. The fact that religious statements frequently conflict with the observed physical phenomena proves that, in contrast to physical perception, the spirit is autonomous, and that psychic experience is to a certain extent independent of physical data. The psyche is an autonomous factor, and religious statements are psychic confessions, which in the last resort are based on the unconscious, i.e., on transcendental processes. These processes are not acceptable to physical perception, but demonstrate their existence through the confessions of the psyche. The resultant statements are filtered through the medium of human consciousness. That is to say, they are given visible forms, which in their turn are subject to manifold influences from within and without. That is why whenever we speak of religious contents, we move in a world of images that point to something ineffable. We do not know how clear or unclear these images, metaphors, and concepts are in respect to their transcendental object. If, for instance, we say God, we give expression to an image or verbal concept which has undergone many changes in the course of time. We are, however, unable to say with any degree of certainty, unless it be by faith, whether these changes affect only the images and concepts or the unspeakable itself. After all, we can imagine God as an eternally flowing current of vital energy that endlessly changes shape just as easily as we can imagine him as an eternally unmoved, unchangeable essence. Our reason is sure only of one thing, that it manipulates images and ideas which are dependent on human imagination and its temporal and local conditions, and which have therefore changed innumerable times in the course of their long history. There is no doubt that there is something behind these images that transcends consciousness and operates in such a way that the statements do not vary limitlessly and chaotically, but clearly all relate to a few basic principles or archetypes. These, like the psyche itself, or like matter, are unknowable as such. All we can do is construct models of them, which we know to be inadequate, a fact which is confirmed again and again by religious statements. So basically what Dr. Jung is saying in this paragraph 555 is that all religions are models trying to describe what's going on in the unconscious. Paragraph 556. If, therefore, in what follows I concern myself with these metaphysical objects, I am quite conscious that I am moving in a world of images, and that none of my reflections touches the essence of the unknowable. I am also too well aware of how limited our own powers of conception, to say nothing of the feebleness and poverty of language, to imagine that my remarks mean anything more in principle than what a primitive man means when he conceives of his God as a hare or snake. But although our whole world of religious ideas consists of anthropomorphic images that would never stand up to rational criticism, we should never forget that they are based on numinous archetypes, i.e., on an emotional foundation which is unassailable by reason. We are dealing with psychic facts which logic can overlook but not eliminate. In this connection, Tertullian has already appealed quite rightly to the testimony of the soul. He says, quote, "These testimonies of the soul are as simple as they are true, as obvious as they are simple, as common as they are obvious, as natural as they are common, as divine as they are natural. I think that they cannot appear to anyone to be trifling and ridiculous if he considers the majesty of nature, whence the authority of the soul is derived. What you allow to the mistress, you will assign to the disciple. Nature is the mistress, the soul is the disciple. What one has taught, or the other has learned, has been delivered to them by God, who is, in truth, the master even of the mistress herself. What notion the soul is able to conceive of her first teacher is in your power to judge from that soul which is in you. Feel that which causes you to feel. Think upon that which is in forebodings you prophet, in omens you augur, in the events which befall you, your foreseer. Strange if, being given by God, she knows how to act the diviner for men. Equally strange if she knows him by whom she has been given." Paragraph 557. I would go a step further and say that the statements made in the Holy Scriptures are also utterances of the soul, even at the risk of being suspected of psychologism. The statements of the conscious mind may easily be snares and illusions, lies or arbitrary opinions, but this is certainly not true of the statements of the soul. To begin with, they always go over our heads because they point to realities that transcend consciousness. These entia are the archetypes of the collective unconscious, and they precipitate complexes of ideas in the form of mythological motifs. Ideas of this kind are never invented, but enter the field of inner perception as finished products, for instance, in dreams. They are spontaneous phenomena, which are not subject to our will, and we are therefore justified in ascribing to them a certain autonomy. They are to be regarded not only as objects, but as subjects with laws of their own. From the point of view of consciousness, we can, of course, describe them as objects, and even explain them up to a point, in the same measure as we can describe and explain a living human being. But then we have to disregard their autonomy. If that is considered, we are compelled to treat them as subjects. In other words, we have to submit that they possess spontaneity and purposiveness, or a kind of consciousness and free will. We observe their behavior and consider their statements. This dual standpoint, which we are forced to adopt towards every relatively independent organism, naturally has a dual result. On the one hand, it tells me what I do to the object, and on the other hand, what it does possibly to me. It is obvious that this unavoidable dualism will create a certain amount of confusion in the minds of my readers, particularly as in what follows we shall have to do with the archetype of deity. I just realized that I have not prepared for playing for you the last two paragraphs of this opening preface of Dr. Jung's, which I can bring up in a few moments if you want, or we can begin a discussion now. While I wait for any thoughts to come up on the chat, I'll attempt to set up those other two. Shouldn't take me too long. I'm reading from Answer to Job by C. I'm reading from Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, the 50th anniversary edition. Okay, here is the paragraph 558, which is relevant here, so I'll add it. Paragraph 558 of volume 11 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. Should any of my readers feel tempted to add an apologetic only to the God images as we perceive them, he would immediately fall foul of experience, which demonstrates beyond any shadow of the doubt the extraordinary numinosity of these images, the tremendous effectiveness, mana, of these images is such that they not only give one the feeling of pointing to something real, but make one convinced that they are actually express it and establish it as a fact. This makes discussion uncommonly difficult, if not impossible. It is in fact impossible to demonstrate God's reality to oneself except by using images which have arisen spontaneously or are sanctified by tradition, and whose psychic nature and effects the naive-minded person has never separated from their unknowable metaphysical background. He instantly equates the effective image with the transcendental X to which it points. The seeming justification for this procedure appears self-evident and is not considered a problem so long as the statements of religion are not seriously reading questions. Answer to Job, but if there is an occasion for criticism, 50th anniversary, then it must be remembered that the image and the statement paragraph are psychic processes, which are different. What follows, I shall attempt just such a discussion. They do not posit coming to terms. They merely point with certain religious traditions in the realm of psychic processes. Since I shall be dealing with numerous factors, are not only permissible, my feeling is challenged quite as much as my intellect. Now, in this paragraph, I cannot therefore write in pointing to something like the image. But must allow my emotional subjectivity which was painted by Michelangelo to describe what I feel when I read certain books of the Bible. That image, or when I remember the impressions I have received from the doctrines.
What a pain! I somehow got two things playing, and I have to figure out how to stop the second one.
Physician who has been privileged to see deeply into the psychic life of many people. What I am expressing is first of all my own personal view, but I know that I also speak in the name of many who have had similar experiences. Dr. Jung was a medical doctor and psychiatrist, and he practiced for 6 decades. As such, he once said that he had interpreted 80,000 dreams, and obviously understood all the levels of consciousness of the average human being.
I just can't find that that playback on my system at the moment. So hopefully it'll just stop playing. Okay, let me. I'll finish with 558 now.
As I'm reading from Answer to Jung by C.G. Jung, the 50th anniversary edition from 2010. Paragraph 560. In this paragraph, Dr. Jung throws down the gauntlet of what he is going to address in the next 198 paragraphs of this book. Paragraph 560. The Book of Job is a landmark in the long historical development of a divine drama. At the time the book was written, there were already many testimonies which had given a contradictory picture of Yahweh, the picture of a God who knew no moderation in his emotions and suffered precisely
I'm working
from
on
this
it still.
lack of moderation. He himself admitted that he was eaten up with rage and jealousy, and that this knowledge was painful to him. Insight existed along with obtuseness, loving kindness along with cruelty, creative power along with destructiveness. Everything was there, and none of these qualities was an obstacle to the other. Such a condition is only conceivable either when no reflecting consciousness is present
just
at
can't
all,
find
or when the capacity for reflection is very feeble and a more or less adventitious phenomenon. A condition of this sort can only be described as amoral. So there you have it. Right here in paragraph 560, Dr. Jung is calling Yahweh out as amoral.
Oh well. Hopefully this will stop playing here. Okay, that wasn't very copacetic on the last 2 paragraphs. I apologize for that. And
today I'm reading from
I still have no idea
by C.G. Jung,
where that was playing from.
Paragraph 561.
But anyway, I'm here to have a discussion about these things. If you're
how the people of the
into
Old Testament
or
felt about
we can
their
discuss
God,
something
we know
else
from the testimony of the
available
Bible.
for a while longer for Q&A.
That is
in
not
general.
what I am concerned with here.
Grace
but
says,
rather
I'm a
with the way in
Mississippian
which a
trying to
modern
understand
man with
this.
a
Humor
Christian
is really all
education
I have.
and background comes to terms with the
Ironically,
divine
Gray, I was
darkness,
born in
which is
Biloxi,
unveiled in the
so
Book of Job,
at
and
least
what
I
effect
have
it
a
has on
little
him.
bit of that.
I shall not give a cool and carefully
in me,
considered
not
exegesis
much,
that tries to
but,
be fair in every detail,
I was born,
but a purely subjective reaction. In this way, I hope to act as a voice for many who feel the same way as I do,
an Army airfield
and to give expression to the shattering emotion which the unvarnished spectacle of divine savagery and ruthlessness produces in us.
Rather
Even if we know by hearsay
embarrassed that my computer got the
about
better
the
of me,
suffering
I have no
and
idea
discord
where
in the deity,
that material
they are
is
so
from.
unconscious and so ineffectual morally
Something
that they arouse no human sympathy or understanding. Instead, they give rise to an equally ill-considered outburst of affect and a smoldering resentment that may be compared to a slowly healing wound. And just as there is a secret tie between the wound and the weapon, so the effect corresponds to the violence of the deed that caused it.
I have no idea where this is playing from, but what I can do is I can turn off that sound, I guess. Let me see if I can get my system preferences
up. Reading today from Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, paragraph 5-6.
I'm going to close out my Chrome just for a moment. I'll come back online if I can in a minute. Okay, I seem to have cut off the video playing. That got a little bit out of hand, and I'm just bringing up my chat again now. I believe you probably can be seeing this chat, even though I still can't, but I'm going to resolve that momentarily. Okay, here, hello from Denmark. Hello in Denmark. I've finally gotten the chat back up, and I trust that people are hearing me now and not the playing of the video. I'm sorry about that. That last bit got out of hand, and to this moment I still don't know why it got out of hand. I hope you can hear me all right. Okay, Miles says he has questions above. Let me look for the questions. Okay, Miles says, I wonder if our unconscious is the universal consciousness. Physicist Dr. Lanza says that there is a universe consciousness and that life is not a byproduct of the universe, but its very source. Well, I think cosmologists may reasonably differ on the source of the universe, but certainly Dr. Jung believed that the spirit is pushing out through us. It's not us pushing the spirit along. And so, for example, he would say, you don't consciously think your thoughts. They come to you, but you don't know where they come from. And you can't necessarily cause them to come up. And people have called that God over millennia. So, okay, so some say the Bible is inerrant, but it might only be true that it tells us the name Jesus Christ. There are things like the Holy Spirit is pronoun he, most translations, but in Hebrew it is she. Okay, well, I don't know. I'm not Jewish, and I haven't been exposed to the Jewish Bible per se, or the Jewish translation. I think what Dr. Jung would say is that everything in the Bible is true as psychic facts, and basically that was the essence of what he was getting at in this first section of Answer to Job. I have a few notes from the class that I gave on this, and I might read those to you. But definitely in Ion, it's very clear that Dr. Jung is saying that the self is the God image. It's an archetype, and it is communicating outbound to us, and we can communicate inbound in the form of prayer or meditation. But in any case, he is emphasizing that the Holy Spirit has a goal, and nobody's talking about what that goal is. Basically, what he's saying is that all Christianity keeps pointing back at these Pentecostal events at the time of Christ, instead of looking for what's the Holy Spirit doing today. And so anyway, Dr. Edward Edinger did a book called The Transformation of the God Image, and that is his 10-lecture series, I suppose, on Answer to Job. And in it he says, with respect to Answer to Job, whatever your familiar God image, Jung is challenging it. Admit you are annoyed. Ask yourself how you are annoyed. I grieve for you. Jung's quote, I grieve for you, brother, who is about to read this work, unquote. That's how he begins it. So what he's talking about is the transformation of God through human consciousness. And this is a central theme of Jungian psychology, but it's largely been hidden. It's been hidden by opposition from both psychologists like Freud and the Freudian school, and by theologians. But nonetheless, this is what it is, and what he's saying is that religion, the God image per se, has been transforming through the human psyche, through the collective unconscious, as Gray was suggesting. And it's brought out in different ways. There were three phases of it. The Jewish phase was the law, where we had the Ten Commandments, and that worked with humanity for a long time. That sort of approach, the law approach. And then when Christ came, we had the all-good God, and Christianity wanted to write evil out of the system. But they admitted that evil would have to be allowed its day, as the book of Revelation says, in 1,000 years. And but what Dr. Jung was saying is that we don't have psychic energy unless we have opposites, and we can't turn Satan into a children's tale. It is Satan's a real thing, evil is a real thing, and it's balanced against good, and we can only hope that good will manifest successfully. And so what Dr. Jung is saying is that Christianity per se, as it has been taught for 2,000 years, can't stand up against the fact that it doesn't really address evil. And so the God image of the future will be experienced psychologically by men and women, and we will have to understand that the evil is within us. Let's see. And in any case, Miles, I wouldn't venture to say whether God is masculine or feminine. I think God is ineffable and therefore has no gender per se. And you're right, Gray. We couldn't process those last two videos. I apologize for that complication there. And Gray, let's see. But let's see, Miles. Miles says that the Bible is that psychic fact, and I think Dr. Jung would concur with that. That the Bible is true, but it's true as psychic facts, not necessarily as physical facts. There may be certain aspects of the Bible which are historical in nature, including the life of Christ, which outside of the Bible may not be provable, but certainly Christ is a psychic fact in a quarter of the world's population today. CFPU asked me, where does William James differ from Jung regarding the stream of consciousness compared to the collective unconscious? I'm sorry to say that you've stumped me on that one. I don't know enough about William James's work to comment on this question. I apologize for that. And I don't want to make a guess. It's not appropriate for me to do so. My main purpose in all of my work with Dr. Jung's oeuvre is to help people understand what Dr. Jung was saying. I'm not saying that he was correct all the time. I'm not saying that I agree with him all the time, although most often I do. My objective, my personal objective by every video on this channel and all of my work in Jungian psychology is simply to understand what he was saying and how his psychology and depth psychology applies to our world today. That's what I'm trying to do. And my main interest actually is not in individual psychology, but rather in society itself. I wrote a book in 2014 called Political Psychology, New Ideas for Activists. And so that's my general interest. I have made an agreement in my live group when we are face to face that we will not discuss politics. And that is caused by the fact that some of the early members and I had different perspectives, political perspectives. And so when you're looking at video of our live meetings here in Annapolis over the last year and a half, you won't see me talking about politics very much. Occasionally I do when I think I can do it generically. However, I make no such commitment on live Q&As. So if you ask me political questions, I'm going to give it to you right between the eyes, what I think. You may not agree with me, but I am prepared to talk about those matters on live Q&A. And I actually have another channel which I'm starting to activate called Political Psychology. I've started to work with that, and I'm probably try to bring that up over time. Gray says, can you go back to the idea you were discussing about the transition from the rules of Judaism to the individual overcoming evil in Christ? Jung talked about the way that is to come. What was that? I think that the way of what is to come is through you, okay? If you go back to the video that we did a couple weeks back on February 7th about is there a meaning to life, you'll find the Jung's reading of the supreme meaning, and also what that finally boils down to is that each of us is the meaning of life, and all of us, our ancestors going all the way back, really go back to the Big Bang, and certainly to the existence of life on Earth. And all of us are physical, living consequences of the very first single-celled organisms on Earth. And so we are the meaningful results of that process, which has been going on since the beginning of life. And we, in that sense, we are the meaning of life, and we carry within us at least the God image, the archetypal God image, which developed in human beings. There's no evidence to suggest that it is in any other species, not even chimpanzees. Although, I mean, for those of us who have dogs or cats, sometimes people joke that the dog thinks you're his God, and in a sense that's right, but they don't have enough consciousness to think of it in terms of God. You're just the big provider that brings the food, and they're going to stick around with you no matter what. But the idea of God per se only exists in humans, and the idea of this religious archetype, which is the most it's the deepest archetype in the unconscious of individuals. Now, I'm not talking about collective unconscious now. I'm talking about individuals, which Dr. Jung and Dr. Edinger variously call the God image, the self, the greater personality, and there are many other euphemisms for this very deep archetype which is playing out, um, but it is a religious function within all humanity. And we can go anywhere in the world and we will find some version of a religion there. And if we compare those religions, which is what Dr. Jung did very heavily over his lifetime, we find that they're all fundamentally the same. And what he says in paragraph 752 of Answer to Job is that every religious statement of whatever kind is a psychic fact. It's not a physical fact, because if it was a physical fact, it would be included in the books of natural history. But he doesn't make light of psychic facts because, we have to have imagination or we have nothing. And if you just look around the room in which you're sitting right now, everything, every single thing that you can see, except possibly growing potted plants or growing things outside, is the result of human imagination, including you. Okay, all of us were once a glint in our Father's eye, if you will, and there was imagination for creating us. And so everything that is out in the world is a part of, comes from imagination, it comes from the psyche, and there's nothing that wrote it in stone. People's imagination decided how the camera that I'm looking at the moment should look on my desktop, or how my Apple computer operates, or how this screen that's behind me, what that should look like. Should it have small little squares or big ones? All those things came out of the human psyche, and they were outbound. They weren't thunk up per se. You maybe can think of Tarzan going from tree to tree, in the sense that, okay, if you're going to do a screen and you've seen this one, then that gives you an idea to imagine a slightly different screen. But all of these things come out of the imagination. And the imagination is the psyche, and the imagination is real. Okay. Okay, so great. Just to wrap up on this idea of the way of what is to come, that's a fairly complex idea, because it talks about how humans change in our perspective. And unfortunately, that requires blood. And so what Dr. Jung is talking about in the Red Book, in the early part of the Red Book, is World War I. And he was, in 1913, when he began his active imaginations, he was imagining very bloody things happening in Europe, and he thought he was going psychotic. But in fact, it wasn't that. I mean, when World War I broke out, he was in Aberdeen, Scotland, giving a lecture, and he was the happiest man in Europe that day, because he suddenly realized that what he had been envisioning in the 5 visions that he had over the previous 9 months were not him having a schizophrenic breakdown or a psychotic breakdown, but were him manifesting the collective unconscious. And so if you want to know what's going to happen on the gun debate in the United States, for example, then you should meditate on that. And I'm not saying pray, oh God, please make people stop shooting guns at little children. That's not what I mean at all. What I mean is that the American collective unconscious is affected by these bloody incidents, and we are changing very painfully the way we think about things, just as Europeans had to kill, I don't know, 6 or 7 million people in World War I before they rethought how things should be changed. And in 1919, by 1919, Dr. Jung was already predicting World War II because he knew that the change, what was to come, which required blood, was not going to happen or had not yet happened enough. And so he was in his consulting room talking to people about their dreams and visions. And by 1919, he was pretty sure that there was going to be another war. And so if you want to know what is going to happen in the American gun debate or any other topic, you need to examine yourself in terms of what you think is happening in the collective unconscious. I mean, I'm not going to make a political position on this, but what I do know is that we have the worst record in terms of gun violence, I'm sorry, we don't have the worst record. There are many countries in South America that have worse records with guns per 100,000 people, because I was just looking at those stats yesterday. But we have one of the worst records, and certainly worse than most of the countries of Western Europe and Japan and places like Singapore or Taiwan. And that will only be changed with blood, according to Dr. Jung. So the way of what is to come is the clash of these opposites, which cause something new to be reborn. And I think that's the point that Dr. Jung was fundamentally making, is that change comes. You probably know in your own family that when you and your father clashed, you either became sort of enemies in the patricidal sort of way, or you clashed and something new was born, something new respect was gained. And for example, there's this old saw about how young people always think they know everything and they think their parents are stupid, but then by the time they're 30, they realize how wise their parents were. But that only happens after you've gotten out of the logos into the eros and started to actually experience life, and you've had some of these clashes hit you in the face, some maybe that your dad was warning you about or something like that, and that is the way of what is to come, and that's what happens in life. It's what happens in human life, that we change based on clashes, and at some periods we have stasis. I think a lot of people thought we had stasis after the 50s, let's say, or let's say after the peace subsequent to the Vietnam War. We largely thought we had stasis. We still had the USSR facing us, but basically things seemed pretty stable. But what we didn't know was that other people in the world didn't see it that way and didn't experience us that way, the way we experience ourselves. And so, Americans tend to think America is the greatest. Well, I think so too, but for different reasons than others would say. Um, and my cut on how that happens, in fact, and this is within the question of the way of what is to come. I went around the world between 2000 and 2010, let's say, and I kept asking people of different nationalities all over the world, Europe, the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, throughout the Middle East. I went to Saudi Arabia 23 times. I asked a lot of friends in these places what they thought, also Japan. What one factor above all others makes the United States economy the strongest in the world and our military the strongest in the world. Maybe we're no longer the best in the world in education or whatever, but certainly everybody points to America, and we certainly have an immigrant inflow from every country in the world. And it's not an outflow as it is in perhaps India or Japan, where I don't see a lot of people wanting to become Japanese who aren't native-born Japanese, for example. And so what one factor above all others makes the United States unique? And what I finally established was that it's fundamentally our diversity, which is that we have people from every national origin, every religion, every racial and cultural background. And what we do is that we allow constant debate. We have constant debate. You turn on the TV every night and you see this debate playing out. And ultimately, decisions emerge. And they will emerge in the gun debate as an example. And you actually can predict the future if you can get yourself in touch with your own self. Your self already knows what the answer is going to be. I'm not saying I know what that answer is, but that's my thought. And so, okay. So anyway, I've done my best to answer the way of what is to come. Gray age, you don't live in Illinois. Okay. All right. The concept of psychic facts is very unifying, like saying universe means one song. Well, it is one. I mean, a physicist named David Bohm had a very good quote, which I like, which is, the world is I forget the beginning of it. I always have to look this one up, but it ends with constant flowing motion. So the world is one thing in constant flowing motion. We all interact with everything else in the universe, and it's always in motion in some way. And Anna Updale says you start with YouTube video The Way of a Dream. Well, with Marie, I'm not quite sure your point, Anna, about Marie-Louise von France. Okay. I guess let me conflate both Anna's and Fakhri's question about dreams. Dreams are something that emerges from the self. Actually, we are having our psyche, our self, never stops, and the unconscious never stops. our unconscious tells our heart to beat 72 times a minute. It makes us breathe 12 times a minute, etc., etc. It makes all our cells regenerate every 7 years, with the possible exception of our bones. And so our unconscious is busy all the time. And one aspect of the unconscious is the self archetype. And the self archetype is a process that is at work 7 by 24 by 365. Now, most of the time it's drowned out by what's happening in our conscious mind, but sometimes it breaks through. So when we go to sleep and we put our conscious mind aside for a period of time, then we experience our unconscious. Our self is talking to us, and it's sending us communications. Those communications are real, and they need to be interpreted by us. Now, the example I give is a vision, and I very regularly have one vision, and it relates to the traffic laws and speeding. Other people have had to buy radar detectors for their cars. And I have no need for that, because my psyche works like a radar detector, in the sense that I have one vision that I have very regularly, at least 2-3 times a week. And that vision is the side of a black and white police car with the word police across the side of the car. And the police car is going from right to left. And every time that I have that vision, my psyche is telling me that there is something going on with the police nearby. And invariably, within 1 to 2 minutes, I will see police activity. Very often it's a speed trap, but it can also be some sort of traffic accident or a police stop or whatever it is. But invariably, within 1 or 2 minutes of me having that vision, I will see something in the physical world. And that is my psyche communicating to me that something is going on. Now, what is that function actually? What is that process? Well, it's probably stems from our ancestors recognizing that there's a predator around. And so our ancestors who were in trees or whatever probably had visions of a tiger or some other predator coming around. And, this is my 20th and 21st century version of that. And I've been noticing this particular vision for probably 40 years. And so whenever you are presented with an image during your conscious life, that's like a dream, but it also it might be telling you something. It may be warning you. It may be saying all kinds of things. Now, as it happens, I've watched a lot of movies, and so very often what happens to me is that something will be occurring in my physical life, and all of a sudden a movie scene will come into my mind, and I'll actually see a movie scene in my mind, and I'll remember the dialogue almost precisely. And when that happens, that's my unconscious, my 2 million-year-old man, as Dr. Jung would call it, trying to tell me something about my current situation. And it has to do it symbolically, so it does it through presenting me with some movie that I've seen sometime in the last 50 years. But anyway, that's sort of a long dissertation. But what I would say that one should take out of these issues is that your psyche is always functioning. And like ideas or anything else, it is trying to give you its best cut on what you should be doing. Now, it's not that you should do it definitely. Okay, your psyche developed over millions of years, and you got the version that was issued on the day of your birth. And so, first of all, it hasn't developed any further in terms of evolutionary development since your birth. And most of what it has for you goes way back, way back. And so I think the way Dr. Jung put it once was, you need to pay attention to your psyche, to your dreams and your visions, but your psyche doesn't have to live in the 21st century. You do. And so you need to put your consciousness and your morality, etc., overlaid over what your psyche is telling you to do. Your psyche may tell you, you want something or whatever it is. Certainly for men, it might say, I want that woman. And, my anima, for example, always tells me when there's a dark-haired woman in view, it says, I want that woman. And, this happens to me in crazy ways. For example, this last week we've had some images of Hope Hicks on the TV screen, and she has long brown hair. And my mother had long brown hair long ago. And so every time I see a woman with long blonde or brown hair, long brown hair, my animus says, I want that woman. Well, okay, but I have a wife, and she wouldn't take kindly, and she certainly wouldn't take kindly to me running out the door and trying to meet Hope Hicks or something like that. And so that would be my example of how you have to pay attention to the messages of your psyche, but then you have to put common sense on top of that. And so I now know in spades that this is what my anima does, and every time I see a woman with long brown hair, I just sort of chuckle to myself, because then I know my anima is talking to me. But anyway, carry on. What other questions? Fakri, one other point I would make about dreams is where to begin. Dreams come out as psychic facts, which are like a fruitcake. They don't necessarily come out in a linear or logical way. And so what you need to do, and a way to get this to become a process for you, is to make note of your dreams and at least try to write down the events that are occurring in your dream, so that then you can, once you're awake and conscious, number one, you can remember them, and number two, you can think about what these images are symbolizing and what they may be telling you. For example, I told you about the police car, and so after reflecting on the police car vision over many years, it came to me that this is my psyche warning me about a predator. And it doesn't mean, actually my psyche might mean, danger. danger predator, but then I have to put my conscious mind on it and say, well, this is a police officer and he's protecting me like he's protecting other citizens. And so you need to take the symbols that are coming out of your dreams, because this is how your psyche is communicating with you. Your psyche doesn't speak to you in English or Arabic or whatever your primary language is. Your psyche speaks to you in images, because that's what it's always had since the beginning. And that image, that symbol producing facility came up through our animal ancestors over millions of years. And I know that they go way back, because when I was 5 years old, I had a dream about a dinosaur, about a big Tyrannosaurus Rex. And except the dinosaur that I had a dream about was a dinosaur that I could not have seen. And it was constellated because I had gone to a black and white movie with my parents, and it had been about a dinosaur that had come back to life, something like Jurassic Park. But that dinosaur was kind of short, fat, and squat. But that night, I had a dream about a dinosaur that had a very long neck, and its head went up into the trees like 40, 50 feet above me, even higher perhaps. And I had never seen an image of a dinosaur like that. So that image was somehow embedded in my psyche, and it had to be embedded into my psyche more than 65 million years ago, because those creatures haven't existed for at least that amount of time. And so that image is down there, and I think one of the reason kids like dinosaur things that make them seem benign, like little dinosaur toys and that sort of thing, is because a lot of children do have dinosaur dreams or dinosaur visions, and they're real. They're actually in our deep unconscious. Okay, any other questions or thoughts that anyone has? I apologize for the mix-up earlier in this broadcast. Does anyone have thoughts on whether I should continue this series as a series on Answer to Job? I began with just the first 5 paragraphs of the book and some of Dr. Jung's earlier comments on it. And I do think it's important for people to understand this book. Dr. Jung said he would rewrite all of his books except Answer to Job, which he would leave just as it is. And so and Gray says, yes, please. And so in that case, I will tentatively plan to do another session next Thursday at 1:30 again, unless someone comes up with a better time. I'm trying to support followers who are in Europe and the Middle East possibly, and I know that at least one person and probably a couple that are on this live exchange right now are either in Europe or the Middle East, and so I don't want to do it later in the day, but if I do it earlier in the day, then it becomes impossible for Americans on the West Coast to participate. Khalid, thank you for saying thank you. Salam alaikum. It probably surprises you to hear me say that, but I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and it's Good to know that you're able to watch this video, Khaled, because I know in some countries it's not possible. And as it happens, a lot of people that watch my videos through one of my Facebook pages, which is the Archetype in Action Facebook page, actually come from Algeria, believe it or not. And I advertise some of my videos, like the one that I did on is there a meaning to life? I advertise that for that page, and interestingly, Facebook will come back and say 90%, 97% of your viewers on this video have been Algerian women. It's like, okay. Big surprise, but anyway. But anyway, I have made an effort to try to speak Arabic from time to time, but I haven't traveled to the Middle East for quite a number of years now, so it's a bit rusty. But I've probably been to the Emirates maybe 50 times, and to, I know Saudi Arabia, I kept track, so that's 23 visits since 2002. All of my trips have been post 9/11, interestingly. And I was mainly working in the healthcare industry. And so in Saudi Arabia, I began with King Faisal Specialist Hospital, but over the years I also worked with King Fahd Medical City and with the Aramco Hospital in Al Khobar, and many other hospitals as well. And so that has been a very interesting experience. I still have contacts there and friends there who urge me to come again sometime soon. Any other questions about Dr. Jung, though, as we... So, Khaled, where do you live in KSA? I'm just curious. Yes, I'll bet it's Jeddah. But anyway, you don't have to answer. But it's very interesting to have a Middle Easterner participating in this, and I'm glad you're doing it. And if I can be of any help, I see Riyadh. Riyadh is the capital of Saudi Arabia, and I've spent a goodly portion of time there and in various of the hotels there. And I have pictures of Riyadh from 2002, which was long before the big building boom that's gone on in recent years, when there was only two major skyscrapers in Riyadh, Prince Ali bin Talal's building and the Faisaliya. But now there are many, many tall buildings there. So anyway, any other questions or thoughts? And I'm sort of getting a little bit tired of talking, but I will keep talking if people have questions. Okay, Gray, I'll go back and look at your question from Monday night's video. I haven't seen that as yet, but I'll definitely go back and focus on it. Okay, any other questions? All right, so for the time being at least, because I'm recovering from my surgery, I had my ankle replaced about 2 weeks ago, and so I have another month of recuperation. So as a result, we're broadcasting from home our weekly reading group, which we normally hold that group at 7:30 on Mondays, and I've committed to bring that online at 8 every Monday evening, and that will be just our group discussion, which is live and in which you can participate. And then I will also endeavor to continue on with Answer to Job on these Thursday sessions, and maybe you can, Gray, as you're reading your book, you can start to develop some questions that we can address during these sessions. And Khaled says, I searched for someone how interesting Jung, and I found me. Okay, well, that's good. That's a good sign. it means my SEO efforts are working out. And there's plenty about Jung online. Much of it is superficial. And so what I'm trying to do is give a more in-depth version of Dr. Jung's work. And obviously, if you have an interest in psychotherapy, then you would want to attend one of the Jung Institutes around the world, either in Zurich or I think there's one in London, and there are several in the United States, including in New York, Houston, LA, and San Francisco at least. I think there's one in Chicago as well, where you can become a formal Jungian analyst. I have never been tempted to do that because I don't want to be a psychotherapist. I have a lot to say about Dr. Jordan Peterson, but one of the things I know about his life is that he has spent a lot of time in the clinic as a psychotherapist, and I think that, well, let's put it this way. I became a lawyer in 1974, and I practiced law for 5 years. I really loved going to law school. I enjoyed the challenge. It was very interesting. But I absolutely detested the practice of law. And I realized that I was always dealing with other people's hardships, and I found that very difficult to bear. And so in 1977, I began business school in one of the early executive programs. In 79, I got my MBA, and I immediately took my MBA and my law degree and my experiences of living in Japan and got myself a job that allowed me to move my family to Japan and work in Japan for 5 years. And that got me going in international business. And I never looked back. I never really wanted to practice law. Since then, I've had to do so for myself a few times, but I don't do it willingly. I do it painfully. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and I hope you're available to join our group this Monday evening at about 8 o'clock. I'll start the session, and I hope my group will assemble about 7:30 so that we're ready when you go live. And then a week from today at 1:30, I'll do my best to continue on with Answer to Job. So thank you for coming, and nice to see our friends from the Arab world. Thank you, Khaled, for saying hello.